Yes, loud and clear, Roy. Great to
I
hear
think
your
it would
voice.
be presumptuous of me to introduce Paul at this point because he's been our single most popular ILR lecturer for many years. And instead, I want him to tell us about his new life in Ithaca. We miss you. So tell us what's happening, Paul.
Well, Roy, we Sheila and I miss you and our the lovely community in Gainesville and Oak Hammock. Have just moved to Ithaca, New York, and I accepted a position as professor of labor history at Cornell this summer. And so we've been busy moving in, even as I speak. We're having maintenance work done in the basement. We purchased a World War I era home, which is a wonderful house about a mile from the campus. But with age comes maintenance, right? For all of us who are aging, I just turned 60, and so we're doing a lot of work on the house. But the packing is done, and I'm working on my syllabus for the fall, and still really connected with Florida. I'm just really glad that we don't have a sense that we've left Florida behind. And in fact, I've been doing a lot of talks in talking with school teachers in different parts of Florida, and also continuing work with the Florida Historical Society, Florida Humanities, and so those connections to me are very important. And I'm just really excited to be able to rejoin the Oak-Hammock ILR community today to talk about Mercy, and then also maybe Roy even to brainstorm about the next novel that we take a look at. Is that will that suffice for kind of an overview?
Now, Paul, you know how technically incompetent I am, so I was not even able to turn on the mic. But Pam, our new important person, has, and yes, that's very helpful. And when you get through talking about today's book, then yes, I would welcome your suggestions as to next year. And in fact, I'm thrilled to hear that you're thinking in terms of next year. So go at it.
All right. Well, I Toni Morrison's A Mercy is a novel that I dearly love. And I'm just very excited to be able to talk to all about this today. I see just so many familiar faces and friends on the line. I'll just start by how we usually start these sessions, and just to let you know, I'm not a literary scholar. Um, I'm a historian who loves to read novels, and I believe that novels, literature, prose, poetry, music can tell us so much about the times we live in. And in my lectures on history, and certainly in labor history this fall at Cornell, I am incorporating a lot of literature, including A Mercy, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Having given that caveat, I do want to just say how thrilled I am that so many of you, we've been together for quite a while, and we've read a lot of books together, going back to William Faulkner's Intruder in the Dust, James Baldwin. We've read together Zora Neale Hurston. We read a lot of different, Joseph Conrad, Mark Twain, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And it's really an exciting journey for me, intellectually speaking, because I just think that historians, my craft, my field, we just have so much to learn, especially from novelists who write so in a different register. But if there's one book that I would assign to understand early American history, it is Toni Morrison's A Mercy. I think that this book tells us more about what historians used to call the peopling of British North America. I think Toni Morrison's A Mercy tells us more with very spare and beautiful prose than just about any history textbook I can imagine. And I had the chance to read and reread the book several times this summer in preparation for our event today. So my beliefs are just firmer than ever about the importance of this book. This is A Mercy, just to kind of situate it in 21st century literary context, has already been named as one of the top most important novels of the 21st century. It's a book that I think initially when it came out in 2009, I kind of misread the book initially because people were saying it was kind of a prequel to Beloved, and in some ways, and Beloved is a novel that we studied together a few years ago, I believe, and in some ways that's kind of loosely true. But I don't really see the book necessarily as a prequel. I mean, it's definitely it's an antecedent in the sense that the book is really set in the 1680s and 1690s. So obviously that's almost a couple centuries before Beloved and the events involving Margaret Garner and her community. But I think this book is much more than a prequel. And I had the opportunity to watch several interviews that Toni Morrison gave with individuals, which I'll talk about a little bit during my presentation. I really appreciate the fact that Toni Morrison was, in terms of great novelists, about as transparent about her writing process, about her writing style, as any novelist I can think of, at least at this point. Because, as you probably know, if you read literature, if you read novelists or poets, sometimes they tend to be a little opaque about their craft. Toni Morrison really embraced the opportunity to talk about craft, to talk about her writing process. And I think part of that goes back to her incredible expertise as an editor. It's important for us to remember that even before she became a Nobel laureate as a novelist, she was a person who shepherded and mentored literally scores of younger writers and really introduced them to the craft of writing and of getting published. So what I want to do, you probably know by now, as a historian, I am somehow wedded to PowerPoint lectures. So I'm going to do a little screen sharing here, and let me make sure that I am sharing this, and I'm going to, and then hopefully you see the presentation screen. Let me know if you don't see it, and I can kind of adjust it. What makes this novel remarkable, and it is a remarkable novel, is that Toni Morrison is able to bring together so many different elements of subjectivity, of individual feelings, of trauma, of triumph, and bring all these historical events together. Again, as a historian, I'm flabbergasted. I know of no other book that accomplishes so much in less than 200 pages. And I just listed here just a few of the historical events that Morrison has in the book. And she doesn't mention these in passing. These are all critical. The book opens with the backdrop to Bacon's Rebellion, which is seen as kind of a precursor in some ways to the American Revolution. And Bacon's Rebellion was an uprising. It was a multiracial, multi-class uprising against colonial authority in Virginia. And the result in the long term was a hardening of the arteries, if you will, of race and caste laws. Before this time, there's a little more openness and fluidity in terms of how one could transition from being an indentured laborer, that is a laborer who literally was bought and could be sold sometimes, and that of being a full-fledged chattel slave. When Bacon's Rebellion was crushed, by the colonial authorities because it was multiracial, because it involved Black and white and even some indigenous people working together. The colonial authorities became very rigid in terms of using the law to separate people out so that after the rebellion, there were laws passed. Um, any Black person who struck down a white person was immediately charged with a draconian penalty. The reverse was not true. Um, the laws for making slavery much more rigid and permanent and separating it out from other forms of forced labor like indentured servitude became much more rigid again. But in addition to Bacon's rebellion, the Salem witch trials play a very important role in a mercy. And we see that one of the most incredible sequences in recent literary history where Florence goes into the home of a young woman who is literally being religiously tortured by her mother because not because she's cruel, but because she's trying to perhaps save her from her small religious community that if they believe she's a witch or if she's possessed by a demon, um, they will kill her. And so there's a lot of things going on here. When Toni Morrison was interviewed by Charlie Rose, and you may remember that Charlie Rose did a lot of interviews, and then of course his career, was derailed, self-derailed. But Toni Morrison did a number of interviews with Rose over the years. And when he asked her about A Mercy, when A Mercy first came out, Toni Morrison said, in doing the research for this book, and the thing we have to understand about Toni Morrison, she's a deep researcher. Before she sits down to write a book, she spends months and months really researching the time and place that she's focusing on, whether it's Indian territory in Oklahoma, the Jim Crow Deep South, the Bahamas, et cetera, et cetera. She spends a lot of time researching the place, the time, and especially increasingly over her career, more and more interested in the environment, in the natural environment, and our interaction with that environment. And one of the things that she said to Charlie Rose, which was really striking to me, was that after researching this time period and seeing, in many cases, the really devastating and terrible impacts that religion could have on people's lives, she was more grateful than ever for the founding fathers who really emphasized the importance of the separation of church and state. And there's some very important statements that she makes as a writer in A Mercy about what happens when a religion ends up seizing control of a town, of a polity, if you will. And there's the relationship between the Anabaptists and different religious groups. But that separation between church and state is a very important theme here. What was she trying to accomplish? And again, I love Toni Morrison's incredible transparency. She says here, when she was writing A Mercy, she's told us that she's trying to evaluate the origins of this nation, of the United States, before even the formation of all of the 13 colonies. That's very important. I want us to keep that in mind. And I will, as always, I'll send a copy of the PowerPoint to you, so you'll have that also. Because I don't, as you know, I don't read all the slides. But trying to evaluate the origins of the U.S. prior to the construction of the 13 colonies. And she's especially interested in the social relationships between free and slave. Women especially, women drive this novel. We cannot overstress this point. And this is one of the great characteristics of Toni Morrison novels, is the role that women play, that they're center in almost all of the narratives in terms of sussing out the meanings of the big questions of the human condition. And what it was like before racism had been legalized and institutionalized. And in choosing Portuguese slave owners in Maryland, which at that point was under, you have to remember the so-called British colonies, there was a Catholic ascension during that time. in the British Crown. And so when Jacob Bark rides to Maryland, he's riding into what he thinks is kind of alien territory. He calls them papists, right? There's a lot of religious prejudice in the book, but at the same time, he has to respect them because there is a Catholic on the throne, on the English throne. Not for too long, too much longer, but definitely when Bark makes his trip, right? And so religion is very important. Morrison, by picking a Portuguese slave owner and slave trader from Angola, is reminding us that the Portuguese and the Spanish long preceded English and Dutch and French colonization. And Morrison is trying to remind us that this whole idea of race and racism is a very well established idea even by 1690. Okay, so it isn't something that's just brand new. It isn't just something that happens. It isn't just that racism pops up somehow in the late 1600s. It's something that Europeans brought with them. And I want us to keep that in mind. It's something, these ideas about race and racism are ideas that Europeans brought with them. And we see many clues throughout the book to remind us of that. And this is just an overview. I'm using a few slides that we used in our previous session, I think in 2021. And you can read this at your own leisure in terms of some of the major accolades that Toni Morrison received during her incredible career. And I want us, though, to think about what it means to write, to challenge dichotomies between art versus politics. That was foremost a goal of Toni Morrison. She didn't believe in that dichotomy. She didn't believe that you had art here and politics here. All in her work, those things are unifying. Aesthetics and ethics go together always in her work. The prose is beautiful. It's incredibly, it's hard to find even terms for it. It's heartbreaking. If you read A Mercy carefully, and I've read it now several times, and you really think about the implications of the book even for the characters in their own time, but for us now, it will make you cry. And there are also joyous moments as well that we shouldn't forget. But again, the point I'm trying to make here is that it's all tied up and tangled up with ethical dilemmas. Okay. It is no mistake, and this is one of the great things about this novel. There's so many things I could talk about. Sheila, my wife, and many of you know, mentioned this morning that I seemed a little nervous preparing for this. And I'm always a little more nervous when I'm preparing to talk about Toni Morrison's work because there's just so much going on. And I'm thinking, I got to talk about everything, but you don't really have to talk about everything, right? I want us to think for a minute about two characters that mistakenly I thought in my first read were minor characters, and that's Scully and Willard. And they're two incredibly remarkable characters. First of all, it's clear they're gay. Okay. This is the 1690s. This is not the 1990s. It's not now. This is the 1690s. And there are already a score of laws by that time in the empire, and all the empires, in fact, really, that if they're caught in sexual relationships, they will be not just executed, they'll be tortured. They'll be severely punished and then executed. But Morrison makes them, in a certain sense, a conscience of the novel, even though they're the down and out, they're indentured servants, right? They don't even own themselves. They're at the subject and the whim of others. And Toni Morrison wants to tell us something about indentured servitude, which I'm afraid even labor historians don't teach properly. So we think of indentured servitude now as, well, in the early 1600s or 1700s, if you wanted to get from Europe to the Americas, you could temporarily let yourself out for 7 years to work for someone, and at the end of the 7 years, you would get the so-called freedom dues. They would give you tools to ply your craft, and then you go on and you could kind of work your way up the ladder. Nope, did not work that way. It worked more in line with Scully and Willard's experiences, especially Willard, where their time is continuously being extended beyond the 7 years. Scully has to do time for his mother, who passed away before her indenture was finished. Sometimes time is added for arbitrary reasons. Okay. So they're living very tough lives. They're living on the margins and they're gay. And people around them know that. Lena knows that for very certain, right? And so they're, you could say they're outcasts, but in many ways, they're a moral centerpiece of the story. They're the ones who saved Sorrow's newborn infant. They act as midwives to birth this girl in the water. And it's an incredible sequence. But again, the point here is the connection between aesthetics and ethics, and who are the heroes in these Toni Morrison novels. It's very similar, I think, when you think of Harper Lee, or you think of William Faulkner, or Baldwin, or Zora Neale Hurston. The greatest writers choose sometimes the most marginal and most outcast characters to deal with these moral dilemmas, to be the heroes, if you will, of the story. It isn't the great person who's going to solve the problems here. It's going to be people like Willard and Scully, who in many ways have to live much of their lives in the shadow. So I'm definitely not going to read this whole slide. I apologize. A lot of this is just kind of haberdash. But I wanted to think about, as I was rereading A Mercy, how Morrison uses characters to explain history. And so when we talked about Beloved together, we talked about how Baby Suggs, Seth, and Paul D. Gardner, who I still think are the most remarkable triumvirate in American literary history, allow us to reimagine what it means to be a slave, what it means to be free, sometimes the murky ground between those things. So what Morrison does, I think, in A Mercy is to take a group of women, starting with Lena. And those of you familiar with Roman history know that Messalina was a very much derided character, a very powerful woman in Roman history, a relative of Nero, I believe. And the very name that she's given by religious people, Messalina, is meant to kind of foreshadow her kind of, I'll just say, not so great ethical status. She's a native person, right? She's an indigenous person. She is adopted, and she gives credit to the religious people, the Europeans who adopted her. And so she says, on the one hand, they saved me, but on the other hand, they burned my village to the ground, right? And so, but I want us to think about this. It's a group of women again who are really driving the narrative. Lena, Native American; Florence, enslaved African American; Rebecca, the mistress, the wife of Master Vark; and then Sorrow, who's kind of in between. In the old school, they would have said probably a mulatto character who no one could quite figure out. Okay, she's kind of a wild card, but a very important one. But it's this community of women who, Lena, Florence, Sorrow, and Rebecca, who have to make things work because men are often absent. They're fighting wars. Jacob Vark, the master, is out trading in Virginia or in Maryland. And it's the women who make this farm work, this small plantation of approximately 100 or so acres. It's not the men. And even the men who work, Scully and Willard, are not quite categorized as men. They're kind of more in between in terms of their gender and sexuality. So it's really a very interesting kind of scenario with, again, women, not just women, but a community of women being at the center. I always want to read an excerpt. I love Toni Morrison's prose. And so the excerpt that I'm going to read is from the conclusion of the book. And it really gets to the heart of both the tragedy, but also just the incredible transcendence and the moral power of this book. And the context, the setting here is Florin's mother, who has been trying to communicate to Florin throughout the entire novel. And this is her self-narrative and what she would tell her daughter, what she would tell Florence if she could be with her to explain her life where she came from and why she seemingly cast out Florence. But we know pretty quickly that she didn't cast her out the way that Florence thought she cast her out. And again, we could think of our own parents, our own families, and how these misunderstandings or silences, how many of us wish we could have asked a question of our father or mothers or grandparents uh, or elders before they passed away, perhaps. But this is our chance. And she's talking about when she's still in Barbados and her transition to Maryland and the United States as an enslaved African American woman. It was there in Barbados I learned how I was not a person for my country nor for my families. I was negrita, everything: language, dress, gods, dance, habits, decoration, song, all of it cooked together in the color of my skin. So it was as a black that was purchased by Senor, taken out of the cane and shipped north to his tobacco plants. A hope then, but first the mating, the taking of me and Bess and one other to the curing shed. Afterwards, the men who were told to break we in apologized. Later, an overseer gave each of us an orange. And it would have been all right. It would have been both good both times because the results were you and your brother. But then there was Senor and his wife. I began to tell the Reverend Father, but shame made my words nonsense. He did not understand, or he did not believe. He told me not to despair or to be faint of heart, but to love God and Jesus Christ with all my soul, to pray for the deliverance that would be mine at judgment, that no matter what others may say, I was not a soulless animal, a curse, that Protestants were in error, in sin. And if I remained innocent in mind, indeed, I would be welcomed beyond the valley of this woeful life into an everlasting one. Amen. But you wanted the shoes of a loose woman, and a cloth around your chest did no good. You caught Senor's eye. After the tall man dined and joined Senor on a walk through the quarters, I was singing at the pump, a song about the green bird fighting, then dying when the monkey steals her eggs. I heard their voices and gathered you and your brother to stand in their eyes. One chance, I thought. There is no protection, but there is difference. You stood there in those shoes, and the tall man laughed and said he would take me to close the debt. I knew Senor would not allow it. I said, you. Take you, my daughter, because I saw the tall man see you as a human child, not pieces of egg. I knelt before him, hoping for a miracle. He said yes. It was not a miracle bestowed by God. It was a mercy offered by a human. I stayed on my knees in the dust where my heart will remain each night and every day until you understand what I know and long to tell you. To be given dominion over another is a hard thing. To wrest dominion over another is a wrong thing. To give dominion of yourself to another is a wicked thing. Oh, Florence, my love, hear a Tuame, hear your mother. And that's the conclusion to a mercy. I want to say a few things about, I always try to think about different literary traditions or literary traditions that writers pay homage to and that they follow in their own prose. And I think in our last session where we talked about Beloved a few years ago, I talked more about Morrison and Faulkner. Toni Morrison was very concerned with her connections to William Faulkner and the tradition of Southern writing, especially. She wrote her thesis about Faulkner, and so that remained a concern. But I also thought about Charles Dickens, because if you think about the character Rebecca, and you think about Scully and Willard and many of the characters in A Mercy, again, they're economic outcasts. there are people who have to leave London or they have to leave Europe. They have no prospects. Enclosures happen. They can no longer farm. The commons, the pasturages have been seized control of, bought up by proto-capitalist farmers. And so you have the explosion of debtors' prisons, and debt begins a mercy, right? Debt frame, a mercy is framed by the whole question of debt. First between Senor and Vark, and then Willard and Scully's aspirations to be free. Sorrow and Florence and Lena are all individuals who at one point in their lives have been purchased by and large for debt or to pay off debt, or will be sold to pay off debt. So I thought of Charles Dickens and how his own family background was one of indebtedness, and how that tore apart his family at a young age. His father spent time in a debtor's prison. And that had a big impact, obviously, in his writing of Great Expectations, A Christmas Carol, and many other classics. I also thought, reading A Mercy, this question of punishment, crime and punishment and torture, and there's very powerful passages in A Mercy that reminded me of Great Expectations. And this is one of my favorite. I wish I could have a big poster of this opening filmic sequence adaptation of Dickens's A Great Expectation, where young Pip is running on the marshlands. And it's not a mistake, but this is something that a modern viewer might miss, that he's running through a part of the marsh where the London hanged were brought out by the authorities, people who were punished and executed, maybe for a serious crime, yes, maybe murder, but also maybe for stealing a loaf of bread. And they're gibbeted. What that means is that at the end of that chain, on that gallows looking thing, their bodies were placed in containers, in transparent steel cages, left there to rot as a symbol, as a warning to other poor people. This is authority. This is the power of the monarchy, the power of the crown. And obviously, this plays a major role in Rebecca Vark's whole experience. She says, look, it's much better to be here in the colonies, as chaotic as things are. They're much more chaotic back home, where execution, torture, judicial torture, and executions were almost everyday events where she was raised. Torture frames a big part of A Mercy. That sequence with daughter Jane is so remarkable that we could spend hours just talking about it, where she's trying to prove to her elders in her kind of dissenting Protestant Christian community, I'm not a demon. I'm not possessed by the devil. And the tortures that her elders inflict on her, again, they're not inflicting because they just want to harm her. They're honestly trying to figure out if she's a human or if she's possessed, or somehow she's a demon, in fact. And there's a wonderful, amazing, powerful book, Johann Huizinga, one of the great Dutch historians of the early 20th century, where he talks about judicial torture. Most of this was meted out at the hand of ecclesiastical courts. Some of these are transferred to the colonies, in the English and the Spanish, Portuguese colonies, but by and large, they begin to die out by the time A Mercy, those events take place. But these are the types of punishments that are not unusual in England, in France, in the Netherlands. And again, these are ideas about crime and punishment that Europeans bring with them to the Americas. And the torture sequences, or the places where torture is talked about in A Mercy, sometimes are very subtle. You may have missed when Senor Ortega and Vark are walking up and down the line of enslaved Africans who they're inspecting. The narrators, the observer is careful to note, and Vark, I believe, is noting this actually, the torture marks upon some of the enslaved people that are very distinctive dismembered limbs, clipped ears, um, large brands that are on people's flesh. These were not unusual marks of torture visited upon enslaved Africans, but also indigenous people. There's a powerful tradition in Latin American muralism that memorializes these tortures, the people, indigenous people and slaves being burned alive. But what's important about these, in some ways transcendent over the torture and the death, is the survival. We survived these punishments. There were people who are living to bear witness, and to remember. And remember, memory, or what Morrison calls rememory, is a central part of every one of her novels. Women's labor, too, is central to the story. Morrison insists that we understand that it is women's labor, both their labor as in the case of Mercy, as farmers, as ranchers, as herders, but also their reproductive labor. Without those two forms of labor, there is no colonization. There is no liberal polity, right? However you conceive of that. There is no eventual democracy, as limited as that was. Women's labor holds the key to the entire story. And this is something that I'm sad to say is missing in most US history textbooks. Sometimes, and this is stereotypical, but when I was in high school and then college, sometimes you wouldn't even see a reference to a single woman until what was it? Betsy Ross would pop up, or John Adams's wife would come into the scene. Well, Morrison wants us to know that long before those things, women are the center of this narrative, really driving things. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but when I lecture on early colonization of the Americas, and it's important to remember that the wars, the colonization, the industrial developments, they're all working together. Okay, arms manufacturing, tobacco, shipbuilding, slavery at the centerpiece of really of everything. But cattle, mutton, textiles, pelts, all of these things are being processed. They're being commodified. This is a transatlantic world that the people in Mercy are living in. And it's a very dynamic world. But again, I want us to understand that without labor power, without the labor power of those women in the story, without the labor power of Willard and Scully, there is no action. None of this happens. It's working people at the bottom, at the base, slaves, indentured servants, women who make this economy run, make it work. This is a mural in Mexico City which depicts the tremendous burden that enslaved people were under to build the Mexican, or to build the Spanish Empire in New Spain, which becomes, of course, Mexico City in Mexico. Charlo in Mexico City mural. The blacksmith is a very enigmatic character in A Mercy. And I'm still, all these characters, my ideas about them change over time with each reading. And by the way, Mercy, if you haven't picked up on one of my sub-themes texts today, it's that this is a novel which really rewards multiple readings. And the blacksmith, in my mind, kind of changes slightly, his character. What is his character doing? He obviously has a level of autonomy, which is unusual, especially for a Black person in colonial North America at this time. He's highly skilled. On the one hand, he's an unusual character, but he's not completely alone, because we know now, scholars of the slave trade have really taught us that in many cases, the English and the Europeans and the Dutch and all the rest very often recruited slave labor. That seems odd to use the term recruitment, But in many cases, they were looking for specific people with specific skill sets, iron workers, rice farmers, indigo processors. All of those things took a high level of skill. We tend to think of slavery as unskilled labor. That's a mistake. And that's a mistake that Toni Morrison wants to allow us to avoid. And that's one of the reasons why I think the blacksmith plays such a critical role. It isn't just that he helps Vark, or he designs and builds this incredible gate to this plantation, which Vark himself had originally rejected. But it's the symbolism with the snakes. Okay, Vark has allowed a kind of oppression. Vark has told himself, "Oh, I'm not involved in the slave trade." Right in the beginning, he's very proud of that. I'm not involved in the molasses trade. Once you're involved in molasses and rum, you were involved in the slave trade. Okay, and so Vark holds himself separate from that. But over time, he is tempted, and the blacksmith illuminates this temptation by designing a gate with snakes that actually, instead of venom or tongues coming out of them, flowers come out of them. But it's also a metaphor about the horrors that lay underneath this bucolic plantation paradise. You could have rows of wonderful crops, you could have beautiful flowers, you could have beautiful houses, but underpinning all of that was a terrible evil, a terrible sorrow called human slavery, chattel slavery. Um, the concern here, almost said obsession, that would be a value judgment. The concern in this advertisement, not only about a specific kind of enslaved African who has a specific skill set, in this case, rice cultivation, which is really, really hard. I don't know how many of you here have tried to ever grow rice or have been around rice. It's very complicated. But also the concern over disease, smallpox and pox. And this is ubiquitous. And this obviously disease is one of the major elements that frames mercy. What's going on back in Europe? Again, Rebecca, I think, is the most kind of illustrative of this, because she's always thinking that, it's kind of hard here in this small farm somewhere in Northern Virginia. It's not easy life, but my gosh, I'm glad I'm not back home. I'm so glad I'm out of London or Liverpool or wherever she came from, because that was harsh life. Okay, and there's an escalation of people leaving Europe, leaving England, leaving the Netherlands, leaving France, leaving the Iberian Peninsula. They're being pushed out, enclosure, the destruction of older economies. When Sheila and I were in Scotland several years ago, many of the docents remarked to us that our population used to actually be much larger, but that many people were driven out by the English. People were driven out to make way for sheep or to make way for other types of commodities or crops that were commodifying. I want us to think a little bit about the themes that are not just in a mercy, but the concerns that Morrison has throughout her entire literary career. Colonization, imperialism, how they continue to have a major impact on our world. And also, equally important is the impact that these forces have had on the environment. It's really striking. Oftentimes, the first time I read through a Toni Morrison novel, I kind of glaze over or skip the parts where she's writing about kind of the natural environment. That's a mistake. That's something that, again, subsequent rereadings help you kind of correct, if you will. You pick up on things. Tar Baby, from the very start of Morrison's literary writing career, is this concern about our effect on the environment and how we don't think about these things and how we just kind of take the environment for granted. It's very striking that it's Lena whose people have been wiped out by, as she calls it, the Europes, who she also credits with doing good things as well, but not this aspect. Killing trees. Jacob Vark cuts down these trees in order to build this mansion, which is going to be a kind of an homage to his legacy, right? He tells his wife this. He tells Rebecca. Rebecca's like, "Why do you need this mansion?" And he's like, "I will have it." And at a certain point, he doesn't even rationalize it as much um, because he doesn't have to. But he has to cut down a lot of trees to make that happen. And when Messalina or Lena sees this, she knows right away that there's going to be great misfortune in cutting down these trees to build this edifice to man's hubris, if you will. Toni Morrison, you know by now, if you've read Paradise, if you read The Bluest Eye, if you've read the Song of Solomon, you know that she isn't, obviously her central characters, many, if not most of them, are African Americans. And she's also using these characters to make broader statements, to explore, as she calls it, questions. I love Toni Morrison because she approaches writing a novel the way that a historian approaches research. And she uses the term research probably more often than any other writer I know of, at least in the more recent 21st centuries. But she explores these big themes that historians have often taken for granted, that our textbooks have often taken for granted. I mean, self-sufficiency is one of them. I had to do a double take on this because over and over again in A Mercy, Morrison essentially critiques this idea that you can have a group of self-contained people or a family, and that can be seen as somehow adequate. And she's like, no, that is not enough to keep the society going. It's the isolation of Jacob and Rebecca that in many ways will lead to their downfall. You could say, well, what alternative did they have? Maybe they didn't have an alternative. But throughout, Morrison is especially concerned with telling us how dependent we are on each other and how we must be enlarging our sphere of dependence of people we rely on, people who rely on us. It's not good enough to be the self-contained unit. For many years, or at least a few years, Florence and Rebecca, and maybe even Sorrow thought that it was good enough to be in this tightly controlled small space, but all it took is the death of one man, the so-called head of the family, to make the characters realize that their world had literally turned upside down, or there are alternatives to that, to this idea of self-sufficiency. Kind of move towards a conclusion here, and then I want to open it up for questions and your thoughts. But religion obviously is a major theme here. Morrison, as I mentioned earlier, when she's given talks, she even talks at the John Adams Institute. A lot of the interviews who talked to her, especially shortly after the book came out, she was very concerned with religious extremism. And unfortunately, in the colonial time period, there's a lot of religious extremism, and the Salem witch trials are obviously on the horizon, but they're not all. They're not even maybe even the worst of this kind of perpetual. I'll just call it religious terrorism. And the fact is that it's generally inflicted by a community of men upon women and girls. That's the thing that Morrison wants us to remember. There's a gendered quality to religious extremism in colonial North America. And that's something that she's not going to allow us to forget for one moment. It's painful. It's painful to read the passages, I know, but it's very necessary because it allows us. And again, as I kind of wrap up here, I want us to think about what the novel tells us now, how it speaks to our own time. And I'll conclude by just saying that I had an epiphany after reading and rereading the novel and realizing that Morrison is really telling us that the founding institutions of the society were not made for us. This house was not built for us. This is a theme that Morrison explores, obviously, in Home, the novel about the African-American combat veteran returning from the Korean War. The house is not made for us, and yet we're here. We've somehow hung on. We've made the house somehow our own to a certain extent. But Morrison doesn't want us to forget how we did that, the struggle, how difficult it was. She doesn't want us to forget the roles that people like Scully and Willard, despised outcasts, played to make our lives possible. Florence, the enslaved African women, without her, nothing really gets done. And it isn't that the country was founded in such a way that people could thrive. They don't thrive in a mercy, okay? But somehow they survive. And they demand a level of dignity and respect. And the development of Florence's character, I think, is quite remarkable because she's a person, and her mother kind of knows this, that slavery, her mother knows her mother's a slave. Her mother knows slavery is evil, it's bad. But perhaps what's even worse is to voluntarily become a slave. And this is what the blacksmith tells Florence. But most importantly, this is what the mother knows, the mother's experience. And think about what that means to our own time. The questions of authoritarianism, of religious extremism, of violence, of power, of male domination, of racism, of environmental degradation. But how, again, we manage to grapple with these problems and deal with them in a mature, kind of solidaristic way of coming together is really critical. It's what I think the reason why people called Morrison really the conscience of America in her writings. It wasn't something she set out to do, but it's something that occurs as she's writing her characters, as they're struggling to survive, as they're struggling to make this their home. So I want to thank you for being such a patient audience. The novel brings out so many ideas and thoughts. It's just, it sets my heart to bursting. So I'd like to take this time now to, if you want to offer ideas or thoughts or questions, and let's get a dialogue going.
Well, as usual, you've given us so much to think about, and as usual, you make books that were written a while ago, sometimes a long while ago, very timely. So I'm sure, excuse me, there are questions and observations, and Debbie is going to move around and give you the mic.
Hi, I'm new to this, so pardon me if I take up too much time. I'm not used to sitting in lectures. I fortunately got through college without having to sit through many. That sounds crazy, but small schools are different. It was a good experience. The first thing I wanted to mention is that I had difficulty reading this book because it was so dark. I guess that's a reflection of my own life, perhaps. It's in a bit of a dark place right now, but was life actually that difficult? I mean, it was, you could not venture off your own property or even on your own property safely, perhaps, especially as a woman. Was it really that tough?
Yes, it was tough. But there are also, and I agree with you. I mean, when I first read this book, I thought, oh my gosh, this is really just very difficult. Morrison also wants to remind us, though, that there are kindnesses that happen throughout the entire novel. I mean, a mercy, that's really what that's about. It's very difficult. It was difficult for me to grapple with this because I thought, Jacob Vark he really becomes a slave owner, even though he pretends he's not a slave owner. He's full of moral contradictions, right? That goes without saying. But he has a quality of compassion this is what Morrison is trying to get at by a mercy. He knows what he's doing. The mother knows this is not God doing this. This is a man doing this. This is a Europe doing this. And I think that there's many other kind of passages, again, Willard and Scully, literally saving Sorrow's life and her daughter, her newborn. The native peoples who come to the aid of Florence, they kind of make fun of her, but they give her water, which sustains her. They didn't have to do that. And so, on the one hand, yes, it is a difficult time. There are endless wars. But again, let's take Rebecca Bark's perspective, shan't we? Where she says, hey, things are tough here, but they're way better for me than they were back in London or Paris or Antwerp or many of those places. Yeah.
Okay. There's three parts to it. I guess the second is this also a story about mental illness? Because obviously, the mistress, the widow, is acting so irrationally that she is almost ensuring her own demise. She needs these people, but she's going to sell them, and she can't maintain this household herself. Also, abandoning the large house obviously was a terrible thing to do. I mean, if she had sold it or if she had tried to keep it up, their lives would have been better.
Yeah, I think that's a really intriguing possibility. I mean, I love that idea. Is this about mental illness to a certain extent? I would say I would agree with that there's an element there. I think that Morrison probably is trying to get at also, especially religious extremism, because there's this amazing relationship between the mistress and Lena, for example, especially between Lena and Rebecca Bark, that seems to be ruined at a certain point by either the impact that the disease had on the mistress or her transitioning into a religious viewpoint, which she had rejected earlier because these same people had refused to ensure that her dead children had sanctuary or were going to be saved, spiritually speaking. And things do change over time. So I have not given you a direct answer as my students. You mentioned lecture, and I'll just say I'll use that phrase. I hate it as a student. It's complicated.
Right. It just made it even more dark. But I guess the last one is for our own future. Are we destroying our own ecosystem with no America to go to? What are people going to do? Because they're not going to, you know what I mean? If global warming goes the way it does, people are going to be without jobs. They are going to be struggling for food, and they're going to have no America to go to. What are we going to do?
Yeah. Well, I think this is a question that Morrison uses literature to raise, uses a novel. And I think that she tells us she can't give us just as none of us individually can come up with the answer to your question there, but she can tell us that we can make choices together. We could choose not to build that mansion, right? We could choose not to do that extravagance, or we can choose to change our kind of path. In that sense, Morrison is that's where she's very old school. She's like, there are moral decisions to be made here. I'm going to show you at each juncture that each of these characters, in many cases, could have made a different decision. And in fact, during that time period, there are many people who live relatively in harmony, if you will, with the natural environment. And Native people, but also Europeans as well. And it's just, I'll give one example, Ithaca, New York. At one point, this place, as far as I can tell, and I'm just learning about it, used to be heavily powered by water. There's incredible gorges running through here, and the power of the water is stupendous. Well, historians can tell you in the early 20th century, the oil companies kind of found a way to kind of ascend, if you will. But again, those are choices, and we can make different choices now. So.
All right, Debbie, do you have anyone else with a question before we talk about what you want to talk about next year? Yes, Debbie.
I have one statement. Paul, I just finished reading Lauren Groff's The Vaster Wild. I don't know if you've read it, but it's set in the Jamestown period, which is prior to this era. And it's also a very dark story, and the heroine does not survive. And the quote that was in your talk about Lena saying, if without heirs, it's the value of a swallow's nest. It just doesn't hold value. So I guess Toni Morrison is of the opinion that, you know, each generation has to get better, find its way. What would you say?
Yeah, I agree. You know, there's a book I'm looking at, it's unfortunately on the floor. If you want to read a little more about the challenges that people had in this time period, there's a book by Bernard Bailyn, who was a historian at Harvard, called The Barbarous Years. And it's not quite as compellingly written in some ways as Morrison or the novel that you mentioned, which I want to read as soon as I can. But yeah, that's a very important aspect of the story. And again, getting back to the difficulty of life, the different impressions that exist. Historians, I think, are doing a better job now. And Toni Morrison is one of the novelists who's really helped us kind of, let's be honest, let's be candid. You know, let's not turn this into, we need some inspiration and hope to kind of get through the day, right? But the version of US history that I was taught had nothing about the environment, nothing about humans' impact on the environment. And if it came time to felling trees, so much the better, because those trees had to make way for progress. And you know, by now, if you read one Toni Morrison novel, that's another idea that she critiques the heck out of. What do you mean by progress? Do you really need to cut down those trees? So yeah.
Paul, would you care to share with us your affinity for snow instead of warmth in Florida?
My what about snow?
Your affinity for it.
I heard a rumor we're going to get some up here. Now, I've also been told that it's been snowing less and less over the past several years. But what that means is that as soon as Sheila and I get here, all of a sudden we're going to have a massive snowstorm. Okay, not now, but actually, to be honest with you, it's been in the 90s here quite a bit. You know, we got here the first week of July, and it's so hot now. Some in the summer here that their new homes are being installed with air conditioners. Just extraordinary. But yeah, we are gonna run into some snowfall, I'm sure.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? If not, what about next year? What are you going to talk about, or do you want to ask our audience if they have any requests?
Well, I always take requests. I'm thinking of, Percival Everett wrote that, and I haven't read this yet. What I would do if we chose this, I would kind of hold off on reading it a little bit probably, but we've read Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn together a couple of years ago. Percival Everett has the book James, which maybe some of you have already read, but I saw the Percival Everett, the novel that was made into a movie. Sheila and I saw it a couple months ago and just thought it was splendid. So James is the story, of course, of Huckleberry Finn, but it's turned upside down to where Jim, the escaped African American slave, is really at the center of the story, as opposed to being, kind of Huck's, secondary conscience. So Percival Everett, James would be one possibility that there might be a nice trajectory there.
Okay. Any particular requests that you would want to make? Yes.
I read James recently and immediately felt like I had to go back and read Huckleberry Finn, which I hadn't read since grade school or whenever. I haven't done that yet, but it would be really interesting to see how much is similar, how much is the same, and how much is different.
That is a great idea, taking the two in tandem. I think it's very doable if we decided we wanted to do that now, next summer. Just take those two books.
Well,
And
we will be in touch, and we will plan it well in advance. And I just want to thank you for giving us your time every year. I know that you have so many things that you're responsible for and involved in, but you've just made our ILR program so much better. So thank you, Paul.
well, thank you, Roy. Thank you all for the invitation. Again, I'm just so happy. And every time I can be with the ILR family, call me anytime. You know how to get in contact with me. I know Roy does. And Roy, I want to catch up with you too, just to catch up on your thoughts on these exciting things happening at the University of Florida recently. I've been reading about them, but yeah, love to get your thoughts. But thank you, everyone. It's wonderful working with you.